All right, here we are. This is my little presentation, early modern witchcraft in North America. I'm so flattered that there are so many people here. I cannot believe it. I hope that I don't screw this up too much. A lot of this comes from this book that just came out last month. This is High Priest Raymond Buckland, the father of American witchcraft. This is the first and last biography I will ever write because wow, it was a lot of work. But one of the things about writing a biography of someone like Ray Buckland, it has to be a little bit more than just about his life story. In a lot of ways, it was also about witchcraft developing in the United States and North America. So that becomes a part of the book while I'm working on it because you really have to put the man in the context of the time in which he lived. And Ray was pretty much around for the entire witchcraft explosion in the United States, which really began maybe 10 years later than it did in the UK. So in the US, it was really the 1960s where you have a bunch of public witches coming forward. And that's really different than the UK, where it all sort of happened in the 1950s. So some of this stems from the book, some of it stems from other things. I've always really, really loved witchcraft history and magical history in general. So I love talking about this stuff. And this cannot be too in depth because I only have 20 minutes, but we're going to try to hit some highlights and some things that I think are really interesting. So before I really start and dive in, I have to define how I'm using the term witch in this particular presentation. So when I speak of witches in the modern sense, I'm thinking of self-identified witches, people who say, "Hello, I'm a witch," instead of somebody's neighbor saying, "Look, that's a witch." And I think that's really, really different. And I don't want to discount anyone's opinions about people being witches. Like if you discover your great great grandmother's like spell book or something, and you see all these spells, and you probably think, "Wow, she's a witch." I wouldn't argue with you, but also she probably wouldn't have identified as a witch, at least in not till the 1950s or the 1960s. So America's always been a very magical place, and there's always been a lot of people practicing magical things. But until relatively recently, most people didn't call themselves witches. So I'm just talking mostly here about self-identifying witches. That doesn't mean that your great great grandmother wasn't a witch in the sense that we might use the word today. Also, I'm trying to look at people who made a really big impact on modern witchcraft, and also people where there is a reputable paper trail. And sometimes you hear stories of people self-identifying as witches as early as the late 19th century, early 20th century, and I don't discount that. I think that's certainly very, very, very possible and probably happened. But a lot of times it ends up just sort of being he said, she said. There's nothing that really proves that this happened, like they said, because you really need something that documents it, like a piece of paper that says, "Hey, we did the witchcraft meeting at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on the summer solstice," that sort of thing. So you don't really get that until the 1950s and 60s. You see that weird little guy on the bottom of the slide there? That's a man named L.W. DeLawrence, who basically sold conjure and hoodoo products in the early 20th century, late 19th century. And if you're looking at him thinking he probably shouldn't have sold hoodoo and conjure products, you are absolutely 100% right. But he had a little magical order in Chicago. Did they call themselves witches? It's very possible that they did. Do we have any proof that they called themselves witches? That's really the big thing. So I'm looking at people who called themselves witches and that there's some proof that they called themselves witches at a pretty early time. And when people ask me about early witches, they often ask about the Ozarks. And that's because of the man there on the right. His name is Vance Randolph. And in 1947, he published a book called Ozark Superstitions. Randolph lived in the Ozarks. If you're not familiar with the Ozarks, it's largely a part of Missouri and a part of Arkansas and a little bit of Oklahoma and a little bit of southern Illinois. I actually went to college in the Ozarks in Cape Girardeau, which you can see on the map. It's right on the Mississippi River. And there's a lot of magic that has been practiced in the Ozarks, and this book sort of makes mention of witches. But again, do the people in the book self-identify as witches? So Vance Randolph says that a witch, according to his informants, is a woman who's had dealings with the devil and thereby acquired some supernatural powers, who uses these powers to bring evil. He then goes on to say that newspapers call these people witches, tourists call them witches, but no real person in the Ozarks would call them a witch, because he says that they're clairvoyants, fortune tellers, seers, mystics, purveyors of medical advice, seekers of lost property, the exact kind of things that you would expect someone who's doing magic to do. Though he does hedge his bets, and this is what's really interesting. He says that there are 3 people who admitted that they sold themselves to the devil. And he says, well, they are obviously crazy if they're saying that, and that their neighbors would say they're witches because they don't have a definition of crazy. So maybe there were some witches there. That's certainly possible. It's also interesting, too, when you read how practitioners of magic are sometimes known as. He says they're called witch masters, white witches, witch doctors, faith doctors, my favorite, goomer doctors, and conjure folks. The 2 terms that are really interesting to me are witch masters, which suggests that you're not a witch, you're a master of witches, and then white witches. Do people identify as white witches, or is that just a term used to signify what kind of magic they're using? That's what's really interesting. So perhaps there were self-identifying witches in the Ozarks. Certainly people are doing things in 1947 that look like witchcraft, like we would do it. And today, if we looked at that, we would probably say that is definitely an act of witchcraft. There's also another thing that he writes. He wrote, the conjure words and old sayings must be learned from a member of the opposite sex. Another thing to be remembered is that secret doctrines must pass only between blood relatives or between persons who have been united in sexual intercourse. What's interesting about that is that a lot of magical traditions have long histories of passing on information from male to female and female to male. There were conjure tradition or cunning craft traditions in the UK that did such thing. One other place that I'm going to look at, this is in West Virginia. These comments came a little more recently, but people talk about how do you become a witch. And in this particular instance, they mention a book very specifically. They call it the Black Bible. Now, if there is a Black Bible, you would think, haha, now we have all the evidence that these people were witches and identified as witches. But it seems as if the Black Bible is the Key of Solomon and people are calling it something else. And I like that water witching is still a common term here. That's pretty cool. And so if you were to look at the Key of Solomon, you would see those seals. And if you didn't know better, you might think that those were seals somehow related to witchcraft. So now I want to talk about somebody who very early on definitely self-identified as a witch in the United States. And this is Victor Anderson. You can see him on the left. Below, he's with his wife, Cora. Together, they started what today we call the fairy tradition. Sometimes you see it called the fairy Wicca tradition, which is really strange because it's not Wiccan at all. Victor said that he was initiated into a coven in 1932, and prior to that, he said he had been initiated sexually at the age of 9, which is really problematic. But Victor was also blind, so he interpreted things a lot differently than perhaps most of us would. And a lot of his students have said that that initiation probably happened on the astral plane and wasn't something that physically happened to him. The Harpy Coven thing is really interesting. He says he was initiated into this group in 1939, that its members were from the American South, which has always been a hotbed for magical practice, and that they practiced folk magic and huna. Huna, if you've never heard of it before, is allegedly a Hawaiian form of magic. However, it's not really a Hawaiian form of magic. It was a system created by a white guy who was kind of just made up this Hawaiian tradition. His name was Max Freedom Long, and he started writing about this tradition in 1936. So Huna really could not have been a part of that group necessarily. The big question is, did these people identify as witches? And that we cannot be sure of because there's no written thing. Again, you would need, went to the witch coven meeting at 8 p.m. All we really have is Victor's word on this, but what he describes is not particularly, scandalous or really all that interesting. He says you kind of meet at the Sabbats, you did some magic, and you ate a big meal. If he was making something up, you think you would make up something a little bit bigger than that. Victor lived in the Bay Area of California, and he established a coven by the early 1960s. He certainly didn't have a coven before that. In a book called Drawing Down the Moon by Margot Adler, he says, when Gerald Gardner put out a book of his, I thought to myself, well, if that much is known, it all fits together. So it was kind of inspired by Gardner's going public to do witchcraft things. And the fairy tradition is not reclaiming. However, it had a large impact on reclaiming because Starhawk was an initiate of the fairy tradition, and she was one of the founders of the reclaiming tradition. Another early witchcraft tradition is Central Valley Wicca. This is, again, a California thing. If you look at the map, you can see the Central Valley. That's a very agricultural region in California. And allegedly, Central Valley Wicca has been practiced since the 50s and the 60s in that part of California. And the people who practice it use an older version of the Book of Shadows than what most Gardnerians today use. So Gerald Gardner was one of the world's first modern public witches, if not the first, coming out in 1951. The tradition that bears his name is called the Gardnerian tradition. And he said he was initiated into a coven in 1939. And Central Valley Wicca says that they use probably the early version of that, the 1939 version or a version from the 1940s. There's a lot of different origin stories from Central Valley Wicca. Since I live here, I've heard a lot of them. One of the problems, though, it's an oath-bound tradition. So until everybody can get their hand on their BOS, their Book of Shadows, it's hard to tell whether or not this came before people like Raymond Buckland went public a few years later, or if it really did come right after World War II and in the early 1950s. I put North America on the title of this particular presentation because in 1959, one of Gerald Gardner's high priestesses gets married and moves to Canada. Her name is Deionis, and she could have very much started a coven in Canada, in North America, but she's never claimed to, and there's no evidence that she ever did, but it's certainly not out of the realm of possibility. This is another very early pioneer. This is Joseph Bearwalker Wilson. He claimed to have been initiated in 1963 by a man that he called Sean, and he said he was initiated into like a folk magic tradition. What's really interesting and why we all owe him a big debt of gratitude is he started the first witchcraft newsletter in 1964, which I just think is so cool, and you can tell that I'm very excited about that. He didn't have a whole lot of subscribers, and at the time, if you wanted to get subscribers or something like that, you put an ad in Fate magazine, which he did, and he ended up selling 50 copies of The Waxing Moon in 64 through Fate magazine. He was an early, what we might today call a traditional witch. He corresponded with the man there you see on the bottom left. That's Robert Cochrane, who's often called the founder of traditional witchcraft or one of the first traditional witches. And after corresponding with Cochrane, he starts a tradition called the 1734 tradition. He also helps write the rituals that today we call the Pagan Way rituals, which were a series of rituals that were available to anyone to use that didn't break any oaths that people used in the 70s specifically to expose others to witchcraft. And this is Civil Leak. Civil Leak is someone who immigrated to the United States from the UK, just like Ray Buckland. And for a period of time in the late 60s and early 70s, she was probably the most famous witch in the United States. She was the first witch to ever truly be on an American television show. She was on a game show called To Tell the Truth in 1964. These three women emerge from the fog and shadows, and they're like my name is Sybil Leek and I'm a witch. And you can watch it on YouTube, and it's really cool, and I suggest that you do. She wrote a lot of early witchcraft books. She had a national column of astrology in major papers and her own magazine with her name in it. That was an astrological magazine. And yeah, and she wrote some really important books. And there are covens that still trace their lineage today from Sybil Leek. And this leads us to Raymond Buckland, why I jumped down this rabbit hole in the first place. Ray was initiated in 1963, and then in 1964, he starts a coven in Long Island, New York. That's his wife, Rosemary, putting a crown on his head. And by 1965, Ray and Rosemary sort of go public as witches. So, as you can see here, this is a newspaper article from 1965. Not surprisingly, it's published one day before Halloween. At this time, Ray and Rosemary say they're trying not to be public with their witchcraft, but if you knew them and saw these pictures, you would absolutely know it was them, especially because of the biographical information that is included in the article. The next day, there's another article printed with even more biographical information. If Ray was not seeking publicity, I don't know how this happened. So my thought is he probably submitted his name to a newspaper reporter, or one of his initiates, who was a college professor, suggested to newspaper reporters that they interview Ray and Rosemary and watch some witchcraft rites. So yeah, very interesting. A couple of other witches to talk about, and I'm almost out of time because these are so quick and so fast. This is Leo Martello, who also lived in New York, like Ray Buckland. Ray lived in Long Island. Leo lived in the city proper. He was a strega, an Italian witch, and he's interesting for a lot of reasons. He was a political crusader for gay rights. He was also one of America's first witchcraft writers, releasing the book The Weird Ways of Witchcraft in 1969. He was also, for a period of time, one of the most widely read witches in the United States. He had a newspaper column in a newspaper called Gay, and his column was called The Gay Witch, and they had a circulation of over 20,000 people reading this newspaper, and people would read Leo's articles. So they were getting exposed to witchcraft, which I think is really cool. He also helped stage the first ever witch inn in New York City in 1970 in Central Park. The park originally said, no, you can't do this. We don't want witches. The ACLU gets involved. Oh, now we can have witches. And I just love, you see this growing acceptance of witches, right? You see witches in newspapers, and then you see witches having public events. And one of the biggest early public events was 11,000 people joining this witch, Louise Hunner, in casting a spell at the Hollywood Bowl on the West Coast. She also was a writer, releasing a book called Power Through Witchcraft. And then the first record album by an American witch, Seduction Through Witchcraft. It's a spoken word album. The witchcraft is very different from what most of us practice. If you read the quote that I took from one of her books, you'll see that what she did was very, very different. But again, you just see witches bubbling up from the cauldron and into the public consciousness during this period of time. And while Hunner's witchcraft would not be wildly influential because it was very different from what everyone else was doing, the fact that she still did these things I find really fascinating. And then that leads us to 1970 and 1971. And this is when things really start to explode. On the left, you see Mastering Witchcraft. The author of that book is Paul Hewson, who's still with us. And Mastering Witchcraft was the first book that really taught you how to be a witch. There were a lot of witchcraft books before Mastering Witchcraft, but they were all basically books about history, a little information about witches. Here's a tiny, tiny excerpt of ritual. Hewson said, "These are the things that I do as a witch, and you too can do these things as a witch." So extremely revolutionary. This book is still consulted by a lot of different people. A lot of people who practice what we might call traditional witchcraft are inspired by this book. And the last chapter of this book is basically how to run your own Wiccan coven. So yeah, this and it was published by a major publisher. So again, you see this gradual explosion of witchcraft into popular spaces. And then in 1971, we got one of our first complete books of witch ritual. This was published by Llewellyn in 1971. This is the Book of Shadows by Lady Sheba. The book was not by Lady Sheba. It was a book of shadows that she got from a witch coven in England who had initiated her over the phone. And once she got hold of it, she sent it to Llewellyn, who published it. She didn't take her oaths very seriously. However, this was one of the first complete books of witch ritual and inspired a lot of people and helped people become witches. So I think that there was a lot of good done with this book, even if it wasn't necessarily from the best of origins. So yeah, these are some of our early witches. And what I love about this is that they paved the way for us to be here today talking about witchcraft and doing witchcraft things. Whew. So that was a lot of words in 23 minutes. If you've got some questions, I love questions and I will be happy to answer them. If you don't, it just means I was so thorough that there's nothing left to answer. When will I do my own Book of Shadows? It's pretty much out there. If you read Transformative Witchcraft, even the Witch's Athame, the Witch's Book of Shadows, and the Witch's Wheel of the Year, that's basically my coven's Book of Shadows. Any history regarding Christian witches? There is a lot of history regarding Christians who use magic. The big question is, do they self-identify as witches? And that I'm never sure of, but there's a long history of people using psalms for various magical things. There's a long history of people that you would never expect using magic, like Christian ministers using magic. Again, did they call themselves witches? Do I have a YouTube? There is, but I don't really post about this so much. A lot of it is in High Priest. Some of it's also in Transformative Witchcraft. Let's see. What are your thoughts on Doreen Valiente? I love Doreen Valiente, and we actually share a birthday. She's one of my favorite people. Are there any prominent witchcraft traditions specific to the American Southwest? Not that I know of, though I know Wendy Rule lives out there, and she does a lot of cool witchcraft stuff. If you want to know about Welsh magic, I would read Mars Starling's stuff. So, yeah, let's see. Any other questions? Gatekeeping and coven initiations. You know, a coven's supposed to be perfect love and perfect trust. I don't really know if I'd call it gatekeeping, but you want to make sure that the person being initiated is good with everybody and they're all good with them. Yeah. The group of witches in World War II performed a working to stop the war. There's a novel about that called Lammas Night by Catherine Kurtz. The operation was called Operation Cone of Power. It's something Gerald Gardner said he participated in. He told several people about it. It's referenced in his book, Gerald Gardner Witch. It's also referenced in Doreen Valiente's Rebirth of Witchcraft, which is her memoir. So that's worth reading. I also do a deep dive into it in Transformative Witchcraft. So there's that. What sparked my interest in this topic? I just love history, and I love witch history, and I worry that we don't preserve it very well, so I love to talk about it. And of course, I'm wearing my sunglasses, so Courtney Buckley, my co-host on the Witches Movie Coven, which airs every night at 6 Pacific on Wednesdays, does not hex me. And I do worry about that. Is Wicca the same as witchcraft? A lot of people would tell you no. I would say that Wicca is a type of witchcraft and that there are many different types of witches. Really easy to follow online at Pan Mankey on most major social media platform. And I visited the Buckland Museum of Witchcraft. They were really influential in helping me research this book. And I will be there next Saturday to talk about this book. Yeah. I don't want to write another biography because it's a lot of work, but I love writing about history. And it's every book that I have, I write at least a little bit about history. So I suspect that will continue to happen. So, any other questions? Thank you guys. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. I loved all the questions. I could just chatter on for a long time. If you want to be a hedge witch, there's a lot of books about hedge witchery. Some of them published by my favorite publisher, my publisher Llewellyn. It's a little shout out to my publisher. Yeah. Yeah, and anytime if any of you have questions about this stuff, feel free to send me a message online. I do respond to things. I'm a Gardnerian practitioner. Of course, any book that I write cannot have Gardnerian rituals in it, but I'm certainly influenced by my tradition, and I think that comes through in a lot of the things that I do. So, yeah, I think that's probably about it. Thank you all for the kind words. And thanks for being a part of LlewellynCon. And I hope you enjoy all of the rest of the presentations over the next 2 weeks.